She married a stranger in Vegas. He turned out to be her new boss. Don't. The word came out sharper than she'd intended and she saw him flinch. Don't say my name like that. Not here. Not now. He turned to face her fully, his expensive suit transforming him into a stranger. I can explain. Can you? Everything I told you about who I am, that was real. The circumstances, the background, that was edited. But my dreams, my values, the way I felt about you, none of that was performance. How am I supposed to believe that? How am I supposed to trust anything you say when our entire relationship was built on a fundamental lie? Welcome back, my amazing family. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because you're about to witness a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love and deception. Now, let's get back to the story. The presentation slides about quarterly revenue projections blurred into meaningless shapes as she stared at the broad shoulders beneath the tailored navy suit, the way his dark hair caught the morning light, the familiar gesture of running his thumb along his jaw when he concentrated. 3 weeks ago, those same hands had trembled slightly as he slipped a plastic ring from a casino gift shop onto her finger at 2 a.m. in Vegas. Alex, she whispered, the name escaping her lips like a prayer. He turned at the sound, and their eyes met across the expanse of corporate formality. For a heartbeat, she saw him as he'd been that night, laughing as he attempted to make pancakes in her hotel kitchenette at dawn, flour in his hair, telling her stories about difficult customers and the dreams he was saving up for. Then his expression shifted, professional mask sliding into place, and she realized with crushing clarity that she was looking at a stranger wearing the face of the man she'd married. Miss Baptiste, I presume. His voice was different now, polished, authoritative, devoid of the warmth that had drawn her to him across a crowded hotel bar. Please take a seat. We were just reviewing the third quarter performance metrics. The other executives exchanged glances as Naomi remained frozen in the doorway. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments that should have formed a complete picture but instead created a devastating mosaic of deception. The expensive watch he'd claimed was a gift from a grateful customer. The way he'd known exactly which restaurants to recommend, which shows were worth seeing. His casual familiarity with the hotel's layout when he'd walked her to the elevator that last morning. Miss Baptiste? The concern in his voice was barely perceptible, but she caught it, a crack in his corporate facade that revealed something achingly familiar underneath. She forced her legs to carry her to the empty chair, hyper-aware of every eye in the room tracking her movement. As she settled into her seat, she caught his scent, the same cologne that had lingered on her skin for days after Vegas, that she'd breathed in as she'd fallen asleep against his chest, believing she'd found something real in a city built on illusions. Forgive me, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. I was momentarily overwhelmed by the view. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, so quick she almost missed it. But she'd learned to read his tells during those stolen hours in Vegas, and she recognized the relief in the subtle relaxation of his shoulders. Understandable, he replied, clicking to the next slide. The view from the 42nd floor can be quite disorienting. The double meaning hung in the air between them like smoke. Disorienting didn't begin to cover the vertigo she felt, the way her carefully constructed world had just crumbled around her. She'd thought she'd married a bartender named Alex who'd made her laugh until her sides ached, who'd listened to her dreams of revolutionizing guest services with genuine interest, who'd made love to her with a tenderness that had left her believing in fairy tales again. Instead, she was sitting across from the CEO of Meridian Hospitality, a man whose net worth she could probably find in Forbes magazine, who had somehow thought it amusing to play at being working class for a weekend. The betrayal cut deeper than she'd expected, a sharp ache beneath her ribs that made it difficult to breathe. As he continued his presentation, she found herself studying him with new eyes. The confidence with which he commanded the room wasn't new. She'd seen it in Vegas when he'd convinced the skeptical wedding chapel clerk that yes, they were serious, and no, they weren't too drunk to know what they were doing. But now she understood its source. This wasn't borrowed authority, it was birthright. Our new director of guest experience will be instrumental in implementing these changes, he was saying, and suddenly all attention shifted to her. Ms. Baptiste comes to us with an impressive track record in hospitality innovation. Her ideas about personalized service and authentic guest connections align perfectly with Meridian's vision for the future. The irony was suffocating. Authentic connections. She wondered if he appreciated the cruel humor of those words, given that their entire relationship had been built on his elaborate fiction. Perhaps Ms. Baptiste could share some initial thoughts on our current guest satisfaction metrics? His tone was professionally encouraging, but she caught the subtle challenge in his eyes. Was he testing her? Trying to gauge whether she could separate their personal catastrophe from professional obligations? She stood, grateful that her legs held steady, and moved to the presentation screen. Years of experience kicked in, muscle memory carrying her through an analysis of their data while her mind reeled. She spoke about emotional mapping and touchpoint optimization, about the difference between service and genuine hospitality, all while acutely aware of his gaze tracking her every movement. Fascinating perspective, commented the silver-haired woman to her left, the VP of Operations. This emphasis on authentic human connection, it's refreshing. The word, authentic, hit like a physical blow, and Naomi's composure wavered for just a moment. Their eyes met again across the table, and this time she didn't look away. Let him see her anger, her hurt, her complete bewilderment at finding herself in this impossible situation. Something flickered in his expression, regret, maybe, or recognition of the pain he'd caused. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. I believe authentic connection is the cornerstone of exceptional hospitality, she heard herself saying, her voice carrying a subtle edge. When guests feel genuinely seen and valued rather than performed for, it creates loyalty that transcends transactional relationships. The room murmured agreement, oblivious to the subtext crackling between their new director and CEO. But he heard it, she could tell by the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers stilled on the conference table. Well said, he replied carefully. Authenticity is indeed challenging to maintain in our industry. It requires a certain vulnerability, doesn't it? The courage to be real even when the stakes are high. Was that an apology? An explanation? She couldn't tell, and the uncertainty was maddening. In Vegas, she'd prided herself on reading people, on seeing past facades to the truth underneath. But clearly her instincts were more flawed than she'd believed. The meeting concluded with assignments and timelines, the usual corporate choreography of productivity and accountability. Naomi gathered her materials with mechanical precision, her mind already racing ahead to the inevitable confrontation that would follow. As the other executives filed out, discussing lunch plans and quarterly projections, she found herself alone with him for the first time since that morning in Vegas when she'd kissed him goodbye and promised to call once they figured out how to untangle their impulsive legal bind. He stood silhouetted against the windows, hands clasped behind his back, and for a moment she glimpsed the man who'd held her as the sun rose over the desert, who'd whispered promises about taking things slow, about getting to know each other properly once they returned to the real world. The silence stretched between them after her accusation, heavy with unspoken hurt. Alex's face had gone pale, and she could see him struggling with something, guilt, perhaps, or the weight of explanations he'd never planned to give. You want to know about complicated? Naomi's voice was barely controlled. Let me tell you about complicated. She moved to the window, her back to him, and suddenly she was transported back to that night when everything had seemed so beautifully simple. The Bellagio bar had been crowded, a typical Friday night in Vegas with tourists and business travelers seeking liquid courage or liquid comfort. Naomi had been neither. She'd been celebrating her final interview with Meridian, confident she'd landed the position that would change her career forever. One drink to toast her success, she told herself. One quiet moment before flying home to start her new life. Then she'd seen him behind the bar, and her plans for a quiet celebration had evaporated like desert mist. He wasn't conventionally handsome. His features were too strong, his smile too knowing, but there was something magnetic about the way he moved, the easy confidence with which he handled the chaos around him. When their eyes met, she'd felt that electric jolt of recognition that romance novels wrote about but she'd never actually experienced. What's a beautiful woman like you drinking alone for? He'd asked, sliding a perfectly crafted martini across the mahogany surface toward her. I didn't order this, she'd replied, though she made no move to push it away. You looked like a martini woman. Classic, sophisticated, with just enough edge to keep things interesting. His smile had been devastating. I'm Alex, by the way. And you're going to tell me your name because I have a feeling this conversation is going to be worth remembering. The confidence should have been arrogant, but somehow it wasn't. There was warmth behind it, genuine interest that made her feel like the only person in the crowded room. Naomi, she'd said, surprising herself. And you're right about the martini. How did you know? It's my job to read people. Plus, you've got that look. What look? Like you're celebrating something important but trying to be dignified about it. Champagne would be too obvious, wine too casual. A martini says, I've accomplished something significant, and I'm going to savor this moment properly. She'd laughed, delighted by his perception. Bartender and mind reader. Impressive combination. The mind reading comes with practice. You spend enough time listening to people's stories, you start to see the patterns. Speaking of which, he'd leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. What are we celebrating? And just like that, she'd found herself telling this charming stranger about her career dreams, her passion for revolutionizing guest experiences, her vision of hospitality as an art form rather than a transaction. He'd listened with genuine fascination, asking thoughtful questions that proved he understood not just what she did, but why it mattered to her. You know, he'd said during a brief lull in the bar traffic, I'm working towards something similar. Saving up for culinary school, actually. I want to understand food service from every angle, the psychology of hospitality, what makes people feel truly welcomed versus just served. The way he talked about his dreams, the passion in his voice when he described his vision of creating experiences that touched people's hearts, it had resonated with something deep in her soul. Here was someone who understood that hospitality wasn't just a job but a calling. Hours had passed like minutes. The bar had grown quieter around them as he'd continued working, but their conversation had never flagged. Between mixing drinks and taking orders, he'd shared stories that made her laugh until her sides ached. Difficult customers who'd taught him patience, fellow staff members who'd become like family, dreams he was working toward with the kind of determined optimism she found irresistible. You know what's crazy? She'd said as the bar prepared to close. I feel like I've known you forever, but I don't even know your last name. Morrison, he'd replied, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. Alex Morrison. And you're right, this doesn't feel like a first conversation. It feels like coming home. The words should have been cheesy, but delivered in his slightly rough voice, with those dark eyes holding hers steadily, they'd felt like the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. When he'd suggested they continue talking over coffee, she'd said yes without hesitation. When coffee had turned into breakfast at a tiny diner where he'd known the waitress by name and she'd made the best pancakes Naomi had ever tasted, she'd felt herself falling into something that felt both thrilling and inevitable. I have to confess something, she'd said as dawn painted the desert sky in shades of pink and gold. I'm not usually the kind of person who does this. Does what? Stays out all night talking to strangers. Feels this connected to someone I just met. He'd reached across the table and taken her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. Maybe that's because I'm not really a stranger. Maybe we're just two people who were supposed to meet. The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at her like she was something precious and unexpected, it had broken down every wall she'd spent years building around her heart. By Saturday afternoon, they'd been inseparable. He'd shown her parts of Vegas tourists never saw, hole-in-the-wall restaurants where the food was incredible and the owners treated him like family, quiet spots in the desert where the city lights couldn't drown out the stars, hidden corners of the strip where magic still felt possible. I can't believe I'm saying this, she'd whispered as they'd watched the sunset from the observation deck of the stratosphere, but I don't want this weekend to end. Then let's make sure it doesn't, he'd replied, and there had been something in his voice that made her pulse quicken. Sunday night had found them in a cheesy wedding chapel, giddy with possibility and champagne, promising to love each other forever while an Elvis impersonator pronounced them husband and wife. The plastic ring from the casino gift shop had felt more precious than any diamond as he'd slipped it onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. Mrs. Morrison, he'd whispered against her lips as they'd kissed to seal their impulsive vows. I love the sound of that. They'd made love that night with a passion that had left her breathless and believing in destiny. In the quiet afterwards, as she traced patterns on his chest and he'd played with her hair, they talked about their future with the kind of dreamy optimism that only comes from being completely, utterly in love. I know this is crazy, she'd said, but it doesn't feel crazy. It feels like the most sane thing I've ever done. I know exactly what you mean, he'd replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. For the first time in my life, everything makes perfect sense. Monday morning had been bittersweet. She'd had to catch her flight, return to her real life and prepare for her new job. He'd walked her to the taxi, holding her close until the last possible moment. This isn't goodbye, he'd promised, cupping her face in his hands. We'll figure this out. Long distance, visits, whatever it takes. What we have is too real to let geography kill it. She'd believed him completely. The man holding her, promising her forever, had felt like the most honest person she'd ever met. Standing in this corporate boardroom now, staring at his reflection in the window, Naomi felt the full weight of that betrayal crash over her again. That man, she said quietly, not turning around. The one who promised we'd figure it out together, who said what we had was too real to let anything kill it? Does he even exist? She heard him move closer, felt the warmth of his presence behind her. He exists, Alex said softly. He's standing right here, wondering how to convince the woman he loves that everything that mattered was true. Naomi turned slowly, and the pain in her eyes hit him like a physical blow. The woman you love? You don't even know me, Alex. Or should I call you Mr. Morrison? C.O. Morrison? What's the proper protocol for addressing your secret husband who also happens to be your boss? Naomi, please? No. She held up a hand, her voice gaining strength. You don't get to please me. You don't get to use that voice, the one that made me believe in fairy tales and happy endings. That voice belongs to a bartender who doesn't exist. Alex ran his hand through his hair, the gesture so familiar it made her chest ache. He does exist. Everything you fell in love with, that's who I am. A bartender saving for culinary school? Her laugh was bitter. Working double shifts to make ends meet? Sharing an apartment with 3 roommates? Which part of that was real, Alex? The dreams were real, he said desperately. My passion for hospitality, for creating experiences that matter, that's all real. I do work in our kitchens, in our restaurants. I spend months every year in different positions across our properties because I believe you can't lead what you don't understand. How noble of you, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Playing dress up with the working class. I'm sure it's very educational. It's not like that. The sharp edge in his voice made her step back. For a moment, she saw cracks in his polished exterior, glimpses of something raw and desperate underneath. You think this is some game to me? You think I enjoy lying about who I am? I don't know what you enjoy anymore. I don't know anything about you. You know everything about me that matters. He moved closer, his dark eyes intense. You know that I burn pancakes when I'm nervous. You know that I listen to jazz when I can't sleep. You know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. How convenient that all your personal quirks happen to be true while everything substantial about your life was a lie. The substantial things? Alex's voice rose. You think money is substantial? You think a job title matters more than the fact that I fell in love with you so hard and so fast it terrified me? Don't you dare turn this around on me, Naomi snapped. Don't you dare make this about my values when you're the one who spent 3 days lying to my face. I wasn't lying about my feelings. You were lying about everything else. Your circumstances, your struggles, your dreams. My dreams weren't lies. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could smell that cologne that had haunted her for weeks. Every conversation we had about hospitality, about creating authentic connections, about the responsibility we have to make people feel valued, I meant every word. Easy to be passionate about hospitality when you own 47 hotels. I own them because I'm passionate about hospitality. His composure cracked completely, and suddenly she was seeing him without the corporate mask. Do you think I inherited this company and decided to play bartender for fun? I've worked every position in this business because that's the only way to understand it. I've cleaned toilets and washed dishes, and yes, I've tended bar, because how can I ask people to do jobs I've never done myself? The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard, but she forced herself to stay focused on her anger. It was safer than the alternative. So this is what, your version of undercover boss? Did you plan to seduce the new employee too, or was that just a happy accident? Alex went very still. What did you just say? You heard me. Was I part of your research? Get to know the staff intimately, really understand their motivations. Stop. His voice was deadly quiet. Don't say things you don't mean just because you're hurt. Hurt. She laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut. I'm devastated, Alex. I'm humiliated. I married someone who doesn't exist, and now I have to work for him while pretending my entire world hasn't collapsed. I exist. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip gentle but firm. The man who held you while you told me about your dreams, I exist. The man who promised to figure this out with you, I exist. The man who loves you so much he can barely breathe when he looks at you, I exist. For a moment, caught in his gaze, feeling the warmth of his hands on her shoulders, she almost believed him. Almost let herself remember the tenderness in his touch, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious and rare. Then reality crashed back in. How did I get this job, Alex? He blinked, the sudden change of topic clearly catching him off guard. What? My job. This position. How did I get it? She watched his face carefully, saw the moment he realized where she was going with this. His hands dropped from her shoulders. You earned it. That's not what I asked. How did I get it? Was the hiring process already in motion before Vegas? Did you know who I was when you started talking to me in that bar? The silence stretched between them, and she saw the answer in his face before he spoke. The hiring process was in motion, he said carefully. We'd identified you as a candidate. But Naomi, I swear to you, I had no idea who you were that night. When you told me your name, when you started talking about your work, I nearly choked on my drink. It was the most impossible coincidence I'd ever experienced. Or the most convenient. No. His voice was fierce. No, it wasn't convenient. It was terrifying. Do you know what it's like to fall in love with someone and then realize that pursuing that love could destroy their career? That they might always wonder if their success was earned or given? Is that supposed to make me feel better? That you agonized over whether to tell me the truth? I planned to tell you. He raked his hand through his hair again. I was going to tell you everything Monday morning before your first day. But then I started thinking about how it would look, how it would affect your position here, how you'd always question whether you deserved this job. So you decided to let me figure it out myself? Let me walk into that boardroom completely unprepared? I thought, he stopped, shook his head. I thought I could find a way to tell you that wouldn't destroy everything. I thought if I could prove to you how real this is, how much you mean to me. You thought wrong. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Alex's face went pale and she saw something break behind his eyes. So that's it. His voice was barely above a whisper. 3 days in Vegas mean nothing because of who I am? Everything we shared, everything we felt, it's all invalidated because I have money? It's invalidated because you lied. I omitted details about my circumstances. I never lied about my feelings. Details? Her voice rose again. You call your entire identity details? My identity isn't my bank account, Naomi. My identity is what you fell in love with, my values, my passion, my dreams for what this industry could be. The man who made you laugh, who listened to your stories, who married you because he couldn't imagine living without you. That's my identity. Despite everything, despite her anger and hurt and confusion, she felt herself wavering. Because there was truth in what he was saying, even if she didn't want to admit it. The connection they'd shared, the easy intimacy, the way he'd made her feel seen and understood, that had been real. She'd felt it in every kiss, every touch, every quiet moment between them. But it didn't change the fundamental betrayal. I need time, she said finally, the fight draining out of her. I need time to think, to process all of this. How much time? I don't know. She moved toward the door, then stopped. I'll do my job, Alex. I'll do it well. But everything else. I can't even begin to sort through everything else right now. Naomi, wait. She turned back and the desperation in his voice almost undid her. What we had in Vegas, it was real. Maybe everything around it was complicated, but what we felt, what we shared, that was the most real thing I've ever experienced. She looked at him for a long moment, memorizing his face, trying to reconcile the man before her with both versions she'd known. The bartender who'd swept her off her feet and the CEO who'd apparently orchestrated her hiring. That's what makes this so much worse, she said quietly. Because I felt it too. And now I'll never know if any of it was genuine or if I was just another business decision you made. You weren't. I said I need time, Alex. Please, just give me that. He nodded slowly, something like relief flickering across his features even as pain clouded his eyes. Take all the time you need. But Naomi, what happened between us in Vegas, that was real. Everything else was context, but that was real. She left without responding, walking through the corridors of her new workplace with measured steps, projecting a confidence she didn't feel. But behind her composed exterior, her mind was racing with questions that had no easy answers. In the elevator, as the numbers climbed toward her new office, she caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. She looked professional, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. But behind her eyes, she could see the truth, the bewilderment of a woman who'd thought she'd married for love, only to discover she might have been a business decision all along. The doors opened with a soft chime, and Naomi stepped into her new life, carrying the weight of a secret that could either destroy her career or transform it entirely. She just wasn't sure which prospect frightened her more. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of professional competence and personal torment. Naomi threw herself into her new role with an intensity that bordered on obsession, determined to prove, to herself, to Alex, to everyone, that she deserved this position on merit alone. Her first major presentation to the executive team was scheduled for Thursday morning, and she'd spent countless hours perfecting every detail. As she walked into the conference room, Armed with data and passion for her vision of revolutionary guest experience, she felt a familiar flutter of nerves. Alex was already there, of course, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. Their eyes met briefly as she entered, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Pride, maybe, or anticipation. It made her pulse quicken despite her determination to remain unaffected. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady and professional. "Today I want to share with you a new approach to guest satisfaction that goes beyond traditional metrics." As she clicked through her slides, explaining her vision of emotional journey mapping and personalized service protocols, she could feel Alex's attention like a physical presence. Every time she made a particularly strong point, she caught him nodding slightly, and once, when she outlined her idea for surprise celebrations for repeat guests, she saw him smile. It was the same smile he'd given her in Vegas when she described her dreams for the industry, and it made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with presentation nerves. "Questions?" she asked as she concluded, and several hands went up around the table. The VP of Operations wanted details about implementation timelines. The CFO questioned cost projections. The marketing director asked about brand integration. Naomi fielded each query with confidence, her expertise evident in every answer. Finally, Alex spoke. "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that will set Meridian apart from our competitors. Ms. Baptiste, I'd like you to present this concept to our regional managers next month. If we're going to revolutionize guest experience across all our properties, we need buy-in from every level." The approval in his voice was unmistakably genuine, and she felt a flush of satisfaction that had nothing to do with their complicated personal situation. This was her area of expertise, her passion, and his recognition of that meant more than she wanted to admit. "Thank you, sir," she replied, the formal address feeling strange on her tongue. "I'll prepare materials for the regional presentation." "Excellent work, Naomi," said the silver-haired VP, and the use of her first name reminded her that to everyone else in this room, she was simply a valued new employee, not the secret wife of their CEO. As the meeting dispersed, Alex lingered, gathering his materials with the deliberate slowness she'd learned to recognize as his tell when he wanted to talk privately. "Exceptional presentation," he said when they were alone. "Your passion for this work? It's inspiring." "It's my job," she replied, though she couldn't quite keep the warmth out of her voice. "It's more than a job for you. It always has been." He stepped closer and she caught that familiar scent that had haunted her dreams. "That's what I fell in love with first, you know. The way your whole face lit up when you talked about creating experiences that matter." "Alex," she started, then stopped. The use of his first name felt too intimate, but Mr. Morrison felt ridiculous given their history. "I know," he said softly. "I know you need time. But watching you present today, seeing you in your element, it reminded me why I knew you were perfect for this position long before Vegas ever happened." The admission hit her like a physical blow. "You really were considering me before we met? I'd been following your work for months. Your innovations at the Grandview Resort, the way you increased guest loyalty scores by 30% while actually reducing costs, it was exactly what we needed here." His voice dropped. "When you told me your name that night at the bar, I thought I was hallucinating. The woman I'd been hoping to hire was sitting right in front of me, and she was the most captivating person I'd ever met. That must have been complicated. Terrifying," he corrected. "Because I was already half in love with you by the time I realized who you were, and I knew that pursuing those feelings could destroy the professional opportunity you deserved." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken emotions heavy between them. Finally, Naomi gathered her materials with brisk efficiency. "I should prepare for the Henderson property visit this afternoon," she said. "I'll be accompanying the management team on that visit," Alex replied carefully. "I hope that won't be uncomfortable for you." She looked up at him, seeing past the professional mask to the man underneath. "We're both adults, Alex. We can work together." "Can we?" The question was quiet, loaded with meaning beyond the professional sphere. "We'll have to," she said, and walked away before her resolve could weaken. The Henderson property was one of Meridian's newest acquisitions, a boutique hotel that had been struggling with guest satisfaction scores. Naomi spent the afternoon touring the facilities with the management team, taking notes and observing guest interactions with the trained eye of someone who understood that hospitality was theater, and every moment was a performance. Alex shadowed the group at a respectful distance, and she found herself hyper-aware of his presence. When she knelt to talk to a frustrated guest whose room key wasn't working, she felt his eyes on her. When she suggested modifications to the check-in process that could reduce wait times, she caught him nodding approvingly. The problem isn't the systems, she explained to the hotel manager as they concluded their tour. It's the human connections. Your staff is efficient, but they're not engaging emotionally with guests. People don't just want their needs met, they want to feel valued, remembered, special. How do we train for that? Asked the manager, a harried-looking woman in her 50s who clearly cared about her property but was overwhelmed by declining reviews. We start with storytelling, Naomi replied. Every guest has a story, why they're here, what matters to them, what would make their stay memorable. Train your staff to ask the right questions, to listen for details that matter. She spent 20 minutes walking the front desk staff through simple techniques for personalization, demonstrating how a few targeted questions could reveal whether someone was celebrating an anniversary, traveling for business, or dealing with a family emergency. This is brilliant, whispered one of the younger staff members. I never thought about it like that. As the group prepared to leave, the hotel manager pulled Naomi aside. I don't know who recommended you for this position, but they made the right call. This is exactly what we needed. On the drive back to corporate headquarters, Naomi found herself alone in the car with Alex. The result of what she suspected was careful orchestration on his part, though she couldn't prove it. You were incredible today, he said as they merged onto the highway. The way you connected with that staff, the solutions you proposed, it's exactly why I knew you belonged at Meridian. It's what I do, she replied, though she felt a flush of pride at his praise. It's what you're gifted at. There's a difference. He glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. The way you see people, the way you understand what they need, it's rare. They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Naomi found herself studying his profile. The strong jaw, the way his hair caught the afternoon light, the familiar gesture of running his thumb along the steering wheel when he was thinking, it was all achingly familiar from their weekend together. Can I ask you something? She said suddenly. Anything. When you work undercover in your properties, do you always use a different identity? He considered the question carefully. I use different backgrounds, yes. Sometimes I'm a new hire, sometimes I'm covering for someone who's out sick, sometimes I'm a consultant brought in to observe. The key is fitting in naturally so people act normally around me. Do you ever feel guilty about deceiving them? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with personal meaning. Alex was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Every day, he said finally. But I tell myself it's necessary for the greater good. If I can't understand what our employees experience, how can I make decisions that affect their lives? If I don't know what our guests really encounter, how can I ensure we're delivering on our promises? The greater good, she repeated softly. It sounds self-serving when I say it out loud, he admitted. But yes, I believe that understanding the truth, even if it requires some deception to uncover, ultimately serves everyone better. And in Vegas? What greater good did that serve? He pulled into the corporate parking garage and turned off the engine before answering. In the sudden quiet, she could hear her own heartbeat. In Vegas, there was no greater good, he said quietly. In Vegas, I was just a man who fell in love with an extraordinary woman and was too afraid to risk losing her by telling the truth. The honesty in his voice made her chest tight. And look how well that worked out. Naomi. He turned to face her fully, and the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust in the worst possible way. But what we had, what we shared, that wasn't deception. That was the most honest I've ever been with anyone. She looked at him for a long moment, seeing the man who'd held her as they'd watched the sun rise over the desert, who'd promised her forever with such conviction she'd believed him completely. I need to go, she said softly, gathering her things. Thank you for including me in today's visit. It was valuable experience. Naomi, wait. She paused with her hand on the door handle. Would you have dinner with me? Just to talk. About work, about whatever you want. I miss talking to you. The vulnerability in his request nearly undid her. Alex. As colleagues, he added quickly. Nothing more than that. I just miss having conversations with someone who understands this business the way you do. It was a reasonable request. Professional. Safe. Which made it all the more dangerous because they both knew there was nothing safe about the way they affected each other. I'll think about it, she said finally, and left before she could change her mind. As she walked to her car, she could feel him watching her, could sense the weight of everything unsaid between them. The professional respect was real. She could see it in how he'd supported her presentation, how he'd praised her work at Henderson, how naturally he'd included her in strategic decisions. But underneath the professional relationship, the personal connection still burned as bright as ever. And that terrified her more than any corporate politics ever could. 3 days later, Naomi found herself staying late at the office, buried in preparation for the regional manager's presentation. The corporate headquarters was eerily quiet after hours, with only the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of the cleaning crew breaking the silence. She was deep in spreadsheet analysis when a soft knock on her office door made her look up. Alex stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and looking hesitant in a way that reminded her of the man she'd met in Vegas. "I saw your light on," he said. "Thought you might need caffeine." She glanced at the clock. It was past 9 p.m. "What are you still doing here?" "Same thing you are, probably. Work." He held up one of the cups. "This is a peace offering. The good stuff from the executive kitchen, not the break room swill." Despite herself, she smiled. "Bribery, Mr. Morrison?" "Absolutely." His answering smile was warm and genuine. "Is it working?" "Maybe." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "You can come in, but I'm warning you, I'm drowning in data about guest satisfaction correlation with staff retention rates." "Sounds fascinating," he said, settling into the chair and passing her the coffee. "Talk me through it." For the next hour they worked side by side, falling into an easy rhythm that felt dangerously natural. Alex offered insights about operational challenges she hadn't considered, while she explained the psychological principles behind guest loyalty patterns. It was exactly the kind of intellectual collaboration she'd dreamed of during those late-night conversations in Vegas. "Your retention analysis is brilliant," he said, leaning over to study her charts. "I never thought to correlate employee satisfaction scores with guest review sentiment, but the pattern is undeniable." "Happy employees create happy guests," she replied, hyper-aware of his proximity. "It seems obvious once you see it mapped out, but most companies treat them as separate metrics." "Not anymore. This is going straight into our operational protocols." He sat back, running his hand through his hair in the gesture she'd come to love. "You're going to revolutionize how we approach human resources." The praise warmed her more than it should have, and she found herself studying his face in the lamplight. Without the formal boardroom setting, without the pressure of their complicated history weighing down every interaction, he looked more like the man she'd married, thoughtful, passionate about his work, genuinely excited by new ideas. "Can I ask you something?" she said impulsively. "Always. When you work undercover, do you ever get attached? To the people, I mean. Do you ever wish you could just stay?" The question clearly caught him off guard. He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "More often than I'd like to admit," he said finally. "There's something addictive about being seen for who you are rather than what you represent. When I'm behind a bar or cleaning rooms or working in a kitchen, people treat me like a person, not a position." "Is that why you do it? For the human connection?" "Partly." He looked up at her, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Growing up the way I did, boarding schools, summer camps, tutors instead of friends, I missed out on a lot of normal human interactions. Working these jobs taught me things about people that no business school ever could." "What kind of things?" "That dignity isn't tied to income. That someone can be brilliant and insightful regardless of their education level. That the person cleaning your hotel room might have dreams and stories and struggles that are just as valid as any CEO's." His voice grew softer. "That sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Naomi felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "In Vegas," she said quietly, "when you told me about saving for culinary school, was any of that true?" "The passion was true. I do work in our kitchens regularly and I've learned techniques from chefs across the country. The circumstances were adjusted." He met her eyes directly. "But my love for that work, my respect for the craft, that was completely genuine." "What about the apartment with 3 roommates?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I do have an apartment that I share with 3 other guys. They're all executives who also work undercover rotations. We use it as a base when we're doing extended assignments." Despite everything, she found herself charmed by this glimpse into his unconventional lifestyle. "So you really do live like that sometimes?" "More often than you'd think. It keeps me grounded, reminds me why the work matters." He leaned forward slightly. "Naomi, everything I told you about my values, my dreams for this industry, my belief that hospitality should be about genuine human connection, all of that was true. The only thing I changed was the context." "Context matters, Alex." "Does it?" The question was quiet but intense. Does it change who I am as a person? Does it change the way I felt about you? She was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with emotions she tried to suppress for weeks. It changes whether I can trust you. I know. His voice was barely above a whisper. And I hate that I've given you reason to doubt something that felt so certain. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and she felt herself softening despite her better judgment. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, not the polished CEO, but the vulnerable person underneath who struggled with the same questions about authenticity and connection that plagued her. Tell me about your life, she said suddenly. Your real life. Not the undercover version, not the corporate version. You. He looked surprised by the request, then thoughtful. It's lonely mostly. I have colleagues but not many friends. People want things from me, access, influence, money. It's hard to know who's genuine. That must be isolating. It is. That's why working undercover became so important to me. It's the only time I get to be around people who see me as just Alex. He smiled ruefully. Ironic, isn't it? The only way I can be authentic is by lying about my circumstances. What do you do for fun? Real fun, not corporate entertainment. I read. A lot. I have a ridiculous collection of cookbooks that I actually use. I work in my garden. I have a rooftop space where I grow herbs and vegetables. He paused, looking almost embarrassed. I volunteer at a shelter downtown serving meals. They think I'm just some guy who works in hospitality and wants to give back. The image of him serving meals to people in need, his expensive clothes replaced by an apron, his corporate authority set aside for simple human kindness, it made her heart ache. You really do understand both worlds, she said softly. I try to. But Vegas was the first time I felt like I belonged in both. With you, I didn't have to choose between who I am and who I'm supposed to be. His eyes met hers, intense and honest. You saw all of me, even the parts one didn't share directly. You understood my passion for this work, my need to connect with people authentically. You made me feel like being myself was enough. The words hit her like a physical force, and she had to look away to maintain her composure. Because she remembered that feeling too, the sense of complete understanding, of being truly seen by another person. Naomi. His voice was gentle. Look at me. She forced herself to meet his gaze, and the tenderness there nearly undid her. I know I hurt you. I know I violated your trust in ways that may be unforgivable. But what we shared in Vegas, the connection, the understanding, the love, that was the most real thing I've ever experienced. And if you'll let me, I want to spend whatever time you'll give me proving that to you. The vulnerability in his voice, the careful hope in his eyes, it made her chest tight with emotions she tried to suppress. This is complicated, Alex. I know. We work together. You're my boss. There are professional considerations, ethical implications. I know. He leaned forward slightly. But none of that changes how I feel about you. None of that makes what we had less real. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the lamplight. The strong jaw, the dark eyes that had seen through her professional facades to the passionate woman underneath, the mouth that had whispered promises against her skin in the desert dawn. I should go, she said finally, gathering her papers with hands that trembled slightly. It's late. Let me drive you home, he offered. It's not safe for you to be in the parking garage alone at this hour. Alex. As your boss, he added quickly. Employee safety is a legitimate corporate concern. Despite everything, she found herself smiling. You're not going to let this go, are you? Not when it comes to your safety. Never when it comes to you. The simple declaration made her pulse quicken. Fine. But we're not talking about this. Whatever this is between us. Understood, he said, though the warm look in his eyes suggested he was perfectly content to have won this small concession. As they walked through the empty corridors toward the parking garage, Naomi found herself hyper-aware of his presence beside her. The way he automatically positioned himself between her and the darker corners of the garage, the way he waited until she was safely in her car before walking to his own, it was protective without being possessive, caring without being presumptuous. Naomi, he called softly as she started her engine. She rolled down her window, and he approached her car with the careful movements of someone trying not to spook a skittish animal. Thank you, he said simply. For tonight, for giving me a chance to explain, for seeing me. The real me. Alex. She started, then stopped. Because what could she say? That she was starting to understand his perspective? That the anger was giving way to something more complicated and dangerous? That every moment spent in his company reminded her why she'd fallen so hard, so fast? "Drive safe," he said instead of waiting for her response. "I'll see you tomorrow." As she drove through the empty streets toward her apartment, Naomi's mind raced with everything he'd revealed. The lonely life behind the corporate facade, the genuine passion for understanding his business from every angle, the way he talked about their connection with such honest vulnerability, it was starting to shift her perspective in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. Because despite everything, despite the lies and the complications and the professional impossibility of their situation, one thing was becoming increasingly clear: she was still in love with him. Not just with the memory of the man she'd met in Vegas, but with the complex, flawed, genuine person she was beginning to understand. And that realization scared her more than any corporate politics ever could. The following week brought an unexpected crisis that would test every professional boundary Naomi had tried to establish. A major food poisoning incident at their flagship Chicago property had resulted in 12 guests hospitalized and a media firestorm that threatened to destroy Meridian's reputation overnight. Naomi was in her office at 6 a.m., fielding calls from health inspectors and coordinating with the crisis management team, when Alex appeared in her doorway looking haggard and determined. "I need you in Chicago," he said without preamble. "The regional team is overwhelmed, and you're the only one who understands guest psychology well enough to salvage this situation. What about the Henderson presentation? The quarterly reviews? Everything else can wait. This is about survival." He stepped into her office and she could see the strain in his face. "Naomi, if we don't handle this perfectly, we could lose everything. 30 years of building this company, thousands of jobs, the trust of millions of guests. It all hangs on how we respond in the next 48 hours. The weight of responsibility hit her like a physical blow. "What do you need from me?" "Everything," he said simply. "Your expertise, your instincts, your ability to make people feel heard and valued even when they have every right to be furious with us." Within 2 hours, they were on the corporate jet to Chicago, surrounded by laptops and crisis protocols and the kind of focused intensity that came with high stakes. Alex had shed his usual composed demeanor, revealing the sharp-eyed strategist underneath who'd built an empire from careful decisions and calculated risks. "Walk me through your thinking," he said as they reviewed the preliminary reports. 12 people sick, 3 still in ICU, and every major news outlet running stories about our luxury poisoning palace. "How do we come back from this?" "We don't come back," Naomi replied, studying the guest profiles and incident timeline. "We go forward. We own every mistake, we exceed every expectation for making it right, and we use this as an opportunity to demonstrate what genuine accountability looks like." "That's a hell of a gamble." "It's not a gamble if we do it right." She pulled up her preliminary action plan. "Look at these guests, they're not just angry, they're terrified. They trusted us with their safety and we failed them. No amount of corporate speak or legal maneuvering will fix that. We need to meet them as human beings who made a terrible mistake and are committed to earning their forgiveness." Alex studied her proposal and she could see him processing the implications. "This goes against everything our legal team recommended. Your legal team is focused on minimizing liability. I'm focused on rebuilding trust." She met his eyes directly. "Which matters more to you? You know the answer to that." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Do it. Whatever you need, whatever resources, whatever authority, you have my complete support." The Chicago property was in chaos when they arrived. Staff members were on the verge of panic, guests were checking out in droves, and news crews had set up camp in the lobby. Naomi felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a challenge that mattered. "I need to talk to the affected guests first," she told Alex as they surveyed the scene. "Not their lawyers, not the press. The actual people who got sick. Some of them are still hospitalized. Then we go to the hospital." For the next 18 hours, Naomi threw herself into the most challenging work of her career. She sat at bedsides holding the hands of frightened guests, listened to tearful families describe their terror, and looked directly into the eyes of people who had every reason to hate everything Meridian represented. Alex was with her every step of the way, not as the untouchable CO, but as a man genuinely devastated by the harm his company had caused. She watched him apologize to an elderly woman whose anniversary dinner had ended in the emergency room, saw him promise a young father that he would personally ensure nothing like this ever happened again. "You don't have to do this," Naomi told him during a brief break between hospital visits. "Your presence here could be seen as an admission of guilt." "Good," he replied firmly. "Because we are guilty. We failed these people and they deserve to see that we understand the magnitude of that failure." It was nearly midnight when they finally returned to the hotel, exhausted and emotionally drained from hours of difficult conversations. The lobby was quieter now, though news crews still lurked outside. "Your office or mine?" Alex asked as they waited for the elevator. "My. I need to finalize the compensation packages before the press conference tomorrow." They worked in focused silence for another 2 hours, crafting individual responses for each affected guest that addressed their specific concerns and circumstances. When Naomi finally sat back and rubbed her tired eyes, she found Alex watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "You were incredible today," he said quietly. "The way you connected with those people, the way you made them feel heard even in their anger, I've never seen anything like it." "It's my job." "No." He shook his head. "This went far beyond your job description. You didn't have to spend 3 hours with Mrs. Patterson while she cried about her ruined anniversary. You didn't have to hold that little girl's hand while her parents dealt with insurance paperwork. You did that because of who you are." The praise warmed her, but she was too tired to fully process the implications. "We should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be brutal." "Naomi." His voice stopped her as she gathered her papers. "Thank you. For everything you did today, for the way you represented this company, thank you. We're not done yet. The press conference, the follow-up interviews, rebuilding our reputation, that's going to take months." "I know. But whatever happens, I want you to know that watching you work today, it reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with exhaustion and emotion and the weight of everything they'd shared over the past day. Naomi felt something shift inside her chest, a wall she'd carefully constructed beginning to crumble. "Alex, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know that seeing you in action today, watching you care so deeply about people you'd never met before, it made me remember what real strength looks like." She looked at him across the small space of her temporary office, taking in the exhaustion in his face, the rumpled shirt, the way his hair stuck up from running his hands through it. He looked nothing like the polished CEO who commanded boardrooms, and everything like the man who'd made her laugh until her sides ached in a Vegas hotel room. "We should go to our rooms," she said softly, not trusting herself to say more. "Of course." He stood, gathering his own materials. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we find out if your strategy worked." As he reached the door, she called his name softly. He turned back, and the hope in his eyes was almost painful to see. "Today, working with you today felt like what I always imagined partnership could be," she admitted. "Professional partnership," she added quickly, though they both knew the distinction was becoming increasingly meaningless. "It did," he agreed quietly. "It felt like we were exactly where we belonged." After he left, Naomi sat alone in the quiet office, processing everything that had happened. The crisis had stripped away all their carefully maintained professional boundaries, forcing them to work together with the kind of trust and instinctive understanding that couldn't be faked or manufactured. And in those moments, when he'd supported her unconventional approach without question, when they'd moved through the hospital corridors with perfect synchronization, when they'd crafted solutions with the kind of wordless communication that spoke to deep compatibility, she'd felt it again. The connection that had made her marry a stranger in Vegas. Only now she understood that he wasn't really a stranger at all. He was exactly who she'd thought he was, just wrapped in circumstances she hadn't expected. The press conference the next morning was a masterclass in crisis management. Alex delivered a statement that was both humble and authoritative, accepting full responsibility while outlining concrete steps for prevention and compensation. But it was Naomi's presentation of their guest-by-guest response plan that truly turned the tide. "Every affected guest has been contacted personally," she explained to the room full of journalists. "Not by lawyers or PR representatives, but by members of our leadership team who listened to their stories, understood their concerns, and crafted individual responses that addressed their specific needs." "What about legal liability?" one reporter called out. "Our legal obligations are secondary to our moral ones," Alex replied before Naomi could answer. "These guests trusted us with their safety and we failed them. Our focus is on making that right, not on protecting ourselves from consequences." The bold statement sent murmurs through the crowd, but Naomi saw several journalists nodding approvingly. This was the kind of authentic leadership that could actually rebuild trust. Over the following days, as the media coverage shifted from sensational outrage to grudging respect for Meridian's response, Naomi found herself working more closely with Alex than ever before. They spent long hours crafting follow-up communications, refining their new safety protocols, and personally reaching out to guests who remained hospitalized. The professional collaboration was seamless, but the personal tension was becoming unbearable. Every accidental touch when they reached for the same document sent electricity through her system. Every moment of shared understanding when they communicated without words reminded her of the connection that had made her believe in forever. On their last night in Chicago, as they finally seemed to have the crisis under control, Alex knocked on her hotel room door with a bottle of wine and a carefully neutral expression. "A toast," he said when she opened the door. "To pulling off the impossible." She should have said no. Should have maintained the boundaries she'd worked so hard to establish. Instead, she stepped aside and let him in. "One drink," she said. "To celebrate surviving the week from hell." They sat on opposite ends of the small couch in her suite, carefully maintaining physical distance even as the emotional space between them continued to shrink. The wine was excellent, and after the stress of the past few days, it went straight to her head. "I keep thinking about what you said," Alex said after they'd talked through the day's developments. "About going forward instead of trying to go back. It applies to more than just crisis management, doesn't it?" "Does it?" she asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "We can't go back to Vegas and undo the complications. We can't pretend the last few weeks didn't happen. But maybe—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe we can figure out how to go forward. Together." The hope in his voice was impossible to ignore, and the wine had lowered her defenses enough that she didn't try. "Alex, even if I could forgive the deception, even if I could trust you again, we work together. You're my boss. The power dynamic alone makes this impossible. What if it didn't have to be impossible?" He set down his wine glass and turned to face her fully. "What if there were ways to address the professional complications that would let us explore what's still between us?" "Like what?" "I don't know yet. But Naomi, what we accomplished this week, the way we worked together, the way we understood each other without having to explain, that's not something you find every day. That's not something you walk away from without at least trying to make it work." She was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with emotions she tried to suppress for weeks. "I'm scared," she admitted finally. "Of what?" "Of how much I still feel for you. Of how right this feels when it should feel wrong. Of the fact that working with you this week reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place." The confession hung between them like a bridge she couldn't take back. Alex's eyes darkened with something that made her pulse quicken. "Naomi," he said softly, and she heard a dozen promises in the way he spoke her name. "We shouldn't," she whispered, even as she felt herself leaning toward him. "Probably not," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "But I've spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself I could work with you and ignore what's between us, and I can't. I tried to tell myself that Vegas was just a beautiful mistake, but it wasn't. It was the most real thing that's ever happened to me. Alex, I love you," he said simply. "Not just the memory of you, not just the idea of you, you. The woman who spent 18 hours in hospitals this week holding strangers' hands. The woman who rebuilt our reputation with pure heart and brilliant strategy. The woman who makes me want to be worthy of her trust." The words broke something open inside her chest, and suddenly all the walls she'd built came crashing down. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been trying not to, but I do. I love you so much it scares me." The admission was barely out of her mouth before he was reaching for her, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "Can we try?" he asked, his forehead resting against hers. "Can we find a way to make this work?" Instead of answering with words, she closed the distance between them and kissed him. It was like coming home and starting an adventure all at once. His mouth was as warm and perfect as she remembered, and when he pulled her closer, she melted into him with a sigh that spoke of weeks of denial finally breaking down. "I missed you," she murmured against his lips. "I missed this." "Never again," he promised, his hands tangling in her hair. "Whatever we have to figure out, whatever complications we have to navigate, I'm never letting you go again." And as he kissed her with all the pent-up longing of their weeks apart, Naomi finally stopped fighting what she'd known from the moment she'd seen him in that boardroom. Some connections were too powerful to deny, no matter how complicated the circumstances. The kiss deepened, and years of careful self-control dissolved between them. Alex's hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them, and Naomi felt herself surrendering to feelings she'd fought against for weeks. "Are you sure?" he whispered against her lips, his voice rough with desire and tenderness. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to being just colleagues." "I don't want to go back," she breathed, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I'm tired of pretending I don't feel this." He groaned softly and captured her mouth again, this kiss hungrier, more desperate. His hands roamed her back, reacquainting themselves with curves he'd memorized in Vegas, and she felt herself melting into him with a sigh of pure relief. "I've thought about this every night," he murmured, pressing kisses along her throat that made her pulse race. "About holding you again, touching you again. About telling you how much I love you without fear in my eyes." "Show me," she whispered, and the words were barely out before he was lifting her, carrying her toward the bedroom with the kind of careful reverence that made her heart ache. He set her down beside the bed and just looked at her for a moment, his dark eyes drinking in every detail as if he was afraid she might disappear. "You're so beautiful," he said softly, his hands framing her face. "And not just physically. Your heart, your mind, the way you see people and care about them, you're the most beautiful person I've ever known." "Alex," she breathed, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. "I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust, and I'll spend however long it takes earning it back. But Naomi, you have to know, every word I said to you in Vegas about how I felt was true. The circumstances were complicated, but my feelings never were." Instead of answering with words, she reached for the buttons of his shirt, her fingers working with the kind of deliberate slowness that made his breath catch. When she pushed the fabric off his shoulders, she pressed her lips to the warm skin of his chest, right over his heart. "I believe you," she whispered. "And I choose this. I choose you. All of you. The CEO, the man who works undercover, the person who burns pancakes and reads cookbooks and volunteers at shelters. I choose all of it." The relief in his eyes was so profound it nearly brought tears to hers. He kissed her again, pouring months of longing and weeks of uncertainty into the connection between them. When he pulled back, his breathing was unsteady. "I want to take my time with you," he said, his voice low and intimate. "I want to memorize every moment, every touch. I want to show you how precious you are to me." And he did. With infinite patience and devastating thoroughness, he reacquainted himself with every inch of her skin, whispering endearments and promises against her throat, her shoulder, the sensitive spot behind her ear that made her gasp his name. When she reached for him with equal hunger, exploring the planes of his chest and the strength in his arms, he shuddered against her touch like a man coming home after a long exile. "I love you," he said as they moved together with the perfect rhythm they discovered in Vegas, as natural and inevitable as breathing. "I love you so much, Naomi. My wife, my partner, my heart." The words sent her spiraling over the edge, and she cried out his name as waves of pleasure crashed over her. He followed moments later, burying his face in her neck as he whispered her name like a prayer. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the aftermath, hearts racing and breathing slowly returning to normal. Alex traced lazy patterns on her shoulder while she played with the dark hair on his chest. "So what now?" she asked softly. "How do we make this work in the real world?" "We'll figure it out," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I've been thinking about it constantly, actually. There are options. I could step back from day-to-day operations, focus more on the board and strategic planning. Or you could transfer to a different division where I'm not your direct supervisor." "You do that? Change your entire role for this?" "Naomi." He tilted her chin up so she was looking at him directly. "I'd do anything for this. For you. For us. The company will survive whatever adjustments we need to make, but I won't survive losing you again." The conviction in his voice made her chest tight with emotion. "I don't want you to sacrifice your career for me." "It wouldn't be a sacrifice. It would be a choice, the easiest choice I've ever made." He smiled, the expression soft and genuine. "Besides, maybe it's time for me to step back from the operational side anyway. I've spent so many years working every angle of this business that I've forgotten how to trust other people to do their jobs." "Including me?" "Especially you." His smile widened. "Watching you handle the Chicago crisis showed me that I've been micromanaging when I should have been empowering. You don't need me hovering over your shoulder, you need the freedom to revolutionize this industry the way I know you can." They talked until dawn, planning not just how to navigate the professional complications, but building dreams for their future together. Alex shared his vision of expanding Meridian's reach while maintaining its commitment to authentic hospitality. Naomi described her ideas for creating a new standard of emotional intelligence in guest services. "We could do this together," she said as pale light began filtering through the curtains. "Not just the personal stuff but the professional vision. A partnership in every sense." "I'd like that," he replied. "Though I should probably officially propose first. I seem to remember our Vegas wedding being a bit spontaneous." She laughed, remembering their impulsive ceremony with the Elvis impersonator and plastic rings. Are you saying you want a do-over? I'm saying I want to do it right this time. With your family there, with planning and flowers and a ring that won't turn your finger green. He grew serious. I want everyone to know that you're my wife, my partner, my choice. No secrets, no complications. Just us building something beautiful together. Alex Morrison, she said softly, are you asking me to marry you? Again? I'm asking you to stay married to me, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. To build a life with me, to trust me with your heart, to let me spend the rest of my life proving that what we have is worth every complication it might bring. Yes, she whispered, and the word felt like coming home. Yes to all of it. He kissed her then with a passion that spoke of promises and forever, and she knew with absolute certainty that they would find a way to make this work. The love between them was too strong, too real, too necessary to let corporate policies or professional complications stand in their way. 3 months later, Naomi stood in the garden behind Alex's penthouse, surrounded by both their families and the Meridian executive team, wearing a dress that made her feel like a princess and a ring that caught the afternoon light like captured starfire. Do you, Alexandra Naomi Baptiste, take this man to be your husband? The minister was saying, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? I do, she said, looking into Alex's eyes and seeing their entire future reflected there. Again. The laughter from their guests was warm and joyful, and when Alex slipped the new ring onto her finger, right next to the plastic one from Vegas that she'd never taken off, she felt like the luckiest woman alive. By the power vested in me, the minister continued, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Again. Alex's kiss was gentle and reverent and full of promise, and when they broke apart, the applause from their friends and family felt like a celebration of love conquering every obstacle. Mrs. Morrison, he whispered against her ear as they swayed together during their first dance. How does it feel to be officially, legally, completely mine? Like coming home, she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. How does it feel to be married to your director of guest experience innovation? He laughed, spinning her around as the music swelled. Like the luckiest man alive. Though I should mention, the board approved my proposal to restructure the executive hierarchy. I'm moving to chairman of the board, focusing on strategic vision and expansion. Which means you'll be reporting to our new CEO. Anyone I know? Sarah Martinez from our West Coast division. Brilliant woman, completely uninterested in micromanaging, and thoroughly convinced that you're going to revolutionize the industry. Naomi felt a surge of excitement at the possibilities that opened up. So no more conflicts of interest? None whatsoever. Just a husband who's incredibly proud of his wife's professional accomplishments, and a chairman who's excited to see what his director of innovation can achieve when she has complete creative freedom. As they danced under the stars, surrounded by the people they loved and the promise of a future built on trust and partnership, Naomi marveled at how far they'd traveled from that first devastating morning in the boardroom. Any regrets? Alex asked softly. Just one, she replied, and saw concern flicker in his eyes. I regret that it took a crisis for me to realize that love isn't about perfect circumstances. It's about choosing each other despite the complications. No more complications, he promised. From now on, it's just us building something beautiful together. I love you, Alex Morrison, she said, and the words felt like a vow all their own. I love you too, Mrs. Morrison. Today, tomorrow, and every day after that. As the music played and their families celebrated around them, Naomi knew that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories began with the most impossible circumstances. But with trust, forgiveness, and the courage to choose love over fear, even the most complicated beginnings could lead to the most beautiful endings. Their Vegas wedding had been impulsive and magical, but this was built on truth, understanding, and the kind of deep partnership that could weather any storm. And as Alex spun her around under the starlight, both of them laughing with pure joy, she knew that their real adventure was just beginning. If this story touched your heart, show some love by hitting that like button and sharing it with someone who believes in second chances. Drop a comment below telling me about a time when love conquered impossible odds in your life. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Ashbourne Golden Narratives for more stories that will make you believe in the power of authentic love. Remember, sometimes the biggest lies can lead to the most authentic truths, and the most complicated beginnings can create the most beautiful endings. Until next time, keep believing in love that conquers all.